if you're looking at the history of the post-independent state building cities for whom? In order to develop an equal and a just Caribbean society, space and city, planners need to be attentive to culturally relevant and context-driven, decolonial, and I would say feminist, depatriarchal knowledges and methodologies. Who am I? I'm Milka Sanatan, and I explain my disciplinary lens that I bring to bear on this work. But we have to start with the coloniality of urban infrastructures. As you all know, Port of Spain is not the first capital city of Trinidad and Tobago. And to develop the infrastructures of dependency, but also extraction and exploitation, colonial powers actually ascribe a misnomer to the place. The shortest, and dare I say the weakest colonizer in the history of Trinidad and Tobago is going to have a capital city that will not be questioned fundamentally up until 2024, called Port of Spain. Port of Spain. You have a king named George, so you have Georgetown. You have a boss man named Oxford Street. The governor, I don't know what happened with him and his lady. You have Lady Young. Give them the road. And the idea of places is more than just these symbolic markers. They are historical signifiers of actually the function of it. And in a mercantile economy, having a port where trade is fundamentally done under maritime conditions, the Port of Spain becomes part of the coloniality of the space. And colonies are not meant to be developed to construct societies. They are fundamentally developing economies. So the questions around Columbus is not just a matter of opinion and how you feel, but what is the sense of place that we are developing when we have these unquestioned figures in a backdrop of poverty, or who sits firmly in the Yoruba village. And Dr. Thomas Austin, of course, was part of people reimagining and reordering space to our cultural heritage. So the post-independent infrastructure is actively taking up the question, cities for whom? In fact, the most obvious signifier of the task of the independent state is Independence Square. Again, a renamed place. And if you think about it spatially, you're entering Port of Spain from the east. You have Columbus, you have a cathedral, you have Cipriani, then Branlara, and then the water. Some people say, oh, you just fall off for development, you know? You leave the colonizer, and then they get independence, and then they're dead. You go drown in the sea. Why people bad mind so? But think about it. Spatially, we are walking through town. Columbus, the cathedral, Cipriani, a labor leader, early 20th century, post-war conditions that's going to develop the society, post-independent state, national, male icon, brand arrow, all male figures. To explain what the space is organized by. No different if I go into another sports community in the Port of Spain sometimes. I see Usain Bolt, Michael Jordan, and another male black figure. Male iconography coming to define the urban space. And there's an invisible font that happens in recreational fields, Dr. alluded to, which says no girls allowed here. For some reason, girls have the ability to read this invisible font. Men need special feminist glasses to see that this is not a field for you. And it happens if we design courts and have Hoop for Life program and live sports, but we don't have equal funding to netball and the sports upon which women play at higher uptakes, then we are reproducing inequality. And if you are fine with saying, well, girls don't really play cricket, girls don't really play football, girls don't really play basketball, and you don't have an equitable strategy to encourage the participation of girls in public spaces for those sports, then you are reproducing gender inequality. And that is why we need to have a much more sophisticated lens in the way we think about it. To be decolonial, to be nationalist, in many ways I would argue to be anti-capitalist, because I believe in the commodification of public spaces, and then also to be gender just. And mainstreaming gender equality. has to take on these socio-spatial gender dimensions, which I won't emphasize because Dr. Thomas Austin actually laid that terrain so well in a global context and a regional one. I see some of us are sitting in pairs. I want you to look to the person next to you, just next to some of you are like in pairs, and one person is going to ask a question. So 2 people here, 1 person. Who's the question person here? Who's the question person? On that table, who's the question? You're the question. Who's the question? You're the question. You'll have to be the question. You have 3 people, maybe 2 listeners and 1 question. Alright. Now the person asking the question, I want you to repeat after me. The person answering will have to stay silent until the question is complete. Say, I am on the corner of Duke Street.
I am on the corner of Duke Street.
And Nelson Street.
And Nelson Street.
I have a diary.
I have a diary.
Where do I go?
Where do I go?
The person who's supposed to answer, how's that person? Well, I heard what he said. I don't know. I heard it and here. I don't know.
Could probably go by one of the names.
All-Star Spaniard. Don't look at BP Renegade. What is happening there? That the toilet culture is so weak in our capital city that we even think there is a place to be identified. In some societies, that is not even a question about where as a location, but rather what is the distance between here and another public bathroom, which is quality sanitation infrastructure. And this is how, as city planners, we begin to really unearth the lived realities of people. An infrastructure, withering infrastructure, or resilient infrastructure, let us understand the political subjects that are produced by them. So for anthropologists, we need to make a turn, not to see infrastructure as bureaucratic or technical, or only to measure efficiencies, but in fact it is reproducing political subjectivities. For planners, this is not just about a road, but how do people move through and manage space. This is not just a street. This is not just a pavement. This is what we privilege for pedestrians or vehicular traffic. This is the political economy of desire. And I will allude to some of those things a bit later. So when we see Nalis, and I put full disclaimer, my mother is a librarian. When I see a public library, the reason why I walk to libraries in every society, in every country I go to a cathedral, or the major religion, could be an Orthodox church or whichever one. I go to a cathedral, I go to a national art gallery, and I go to the National Library. And I learn to judge a society. You also have to go to the grocery and the bus stand. That's how people really behave. And then you go in the National Library. And Trinidad and Tobago is not Finland. Finland has 716 libraries. The average Finnish person reads as many as 16 books a year. You have some way to go. And Trinidad and Tobago, if you move through the Caribbean, you'll realize we have a very advanced public library infrastructure comparatively in the Anglophone situation. At the time of independence for some nations, the imagined colonial powers didn't even think of investing in a public library. They had archives in the government house, where the governor general would be, to produce state technocratic knowledge, but not invested in the literacy of the population. A public library is part of an institution and an infrastructure, particularly in metropolitan cities, that are women-led to advance the literacy of the most vulnerable. So if people ever get in a debate about funding allocations of libraries, if people get in a debate where libraries should go, or if people really read, we might be excluding the most vulnerable, the poorest, the bright people in Belmont Boys, or Bishops, or St. Francois, who need some time to do this kind of de facto homework center, for folk traditions to be reproduced at an organic level in the children's library, where librarians read story and give up time in the evening, not always getting overtime. And that is what a library is. It's not just a place for books. And therefore, the gender issues in the cityscapes need to be taken up in a very profound way. So we alluded to sanitation poverty. Dr. Thomas Austin spoke about the latrine eradication program, which is implemented primarily by 2 agencies in Trinidad and Tobago, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government. We have a broader question of sanitation infrastructure and how we could advance a toilet culture that is relevant to our society. In doing that, we have period-friendly toilets. We think about menstrual hygiene and management. We address social taboos around women who bleed and people who menstruate. And we also think about, you can't spell menstruation without men. What is the role of men as fathers, as family members, as members in the community, creating spaces where if half of the population has a physiological experience, we could ensure that that is not some social punishment they experience. Because I could tell you, if I ever menstruated, I would have menstrual leave today. I will be in the trade union fighting for menstrual leave, or that the office floor have pop-up in the middle of the month, because I need to be calm. So there's a lot of work we see in the production of labor that we could begin to do on these gender issues. And what we're trying to disrupt fundamentally is the idea that gender is this neat category of analysis you add and stir. Is the whole pot, is not the carlo, the okra, this is the iron pot, upon which we begin to mix things to say that we understand the differential experiences, but the practical and strategic needs of diverse men, women, girls and boys. Mobilities. Is it that women are afraid of perpetrators, or are they afraid of the night? And in my society, because we do geography, but for some reason I have this difficulty of translating it to our everyday life. If we do time studies, we begin to see women are afraid of the dark. And why? Because of the proliferation of gender-based violence and the risk to their bodies. And that is unacceptable for any serious society, where we begin to think about nobody should be afraid of a time of day. And changing that means we could extend the number of hours women participate in health, sporting and recreational activities. I did a mobility audit in July of Aranguez recreational grounds. And you know what was the most difficult part? The later that we were going in night, the more women were accompanied by a male counterpart, which is obvious when you think about it. Women in the groups, that is right after work. You put on your leggings, you come out work. It start to get darker, your man, your brother, Harry. Male accompaniment. What does that do? Entrench the notion of male complementarity for women's experiences of space. And that logic lends itself to what people see in family life, and what people demand of us in relationships, which may not work all the time. And it's not just women's empowerment and girls' empowerment. How do we have autonomy for women, girls, men, and boys, which is to define and determine choices in their interests on their terms. And that's a paradigm shift we need to take on, a conceptual shift in the planet. Ending gender-based violence. If 1 in 3 women experience a form of intimate partner violence globally, in Trinidad and Tobago is around 48%. That's 46 to 48%. That's 1 in 2. We have a lot of work to do. But we also need to say, because you are planners, when we focus on intimate partner violence, let's not lose focus on experiences of public violence, which are grossly underreported, because sexual harassment is so normalized. Because a man touching you, unwanted touching in the street or a bus, was a bad man, not a bad city. And as planners, these are the interventions we make: gender entrepreneurship and economies of scale. Now, I have a funny politic about this. I find people do empowerment on the cheap and tell working class women, sell Polori, Tulum, and Tamarind Ball, and that is empowerment. But when we do policies for trade and industry, it falls disproportionately to the benefit of men, male leaders of industry. At the same time, I will not have the class condescension to say that woman who is sustaining her livelihoods in her craft, in a micro economy of scale, is any less of a productive economic agent. You all feel me? And therefore, how do I reorient my city to create more economic possibilities, clusters, and safety for people who are in the entry levels of sectors, but also create a policy and fiscal environment to scale up those who have that capacity to take on more risk and to hold more capital? But that is the starting point. If I think you will always be a nail tech to serve people in the area has no more than 2,000 residents, then I have limited your economic possibilities. But if I think taking out our window and serving burgers is less of business, then I am failing you as well. Child-friendly public spaces, planners today could create a minimum standard of the amount of space in public dedicated for children. Today can do that. Every public building, every recreational ground. What is the fixed amount of space dedicated to children? Heat and climate inequalities. So let's take gender. If we have climate inequalities, we have increasing heat, we have the privilege of vehicular traffic with exhaust, and since 5 o'clock in the morning, you have higglers and hustlers on the road, and in the sun, and public water not accessible, and when it's accessible, it's not quality, and we have a weak sanitation infrastructure for the public. You have heat harming informal workers. And these are the questions we have to take on. How does heat as a phenomenon, you sweat it every time? Why is it when we enter a home in the Caribbean now, you stand cold when you walk in the house? Whoo! And the first comment, that heat outside was like something you had to escape from. These are fundamentally gendered.